Hi, I've decided to make a video of a cake that I invented. I'm calling it Gingersnap cake. A lot of people really seem to like it, and so I thought I would make my first ever video in English for baking or cooking. So here are the things that you will need to make a Gingersnap cake. You will need plain flour or all-purpose flour. You will need baking powder, cornstarch, baking soda, salt. For your spices, you will need cinnamon, ginger, nutmeg, and allspice. Allspice is optional. You will also need molasses. This is the standard unsulfured molasses. You can use blackstrap molasses, but I would recommend that you cut the molasses by about half if you use blackstrap. You'll need vanilla. I'm using artificial vanilla. Milk, oil, I prefer canola oil, brown sugar, I like light brown sugar for this. You'll need 2 eggs, 2 large eggs, and optional, you can also use eggnog. Can you pause it? Wait. When we measure ingredients, it's really important that we measure the correct way, because a lot of us are operating without kitchen scales, or we're using recipes that don't give the measurements in grams. And that's okay, but in that case we need to make sure that we're all measuring in the same way. I'll give you an example. I saw a video of a lady who measured her flour by taking the measuring cup and dipping it into the flour. This is going to give her a lot more flour than you would normally use if you're measuring flour the right way. The right way to measure any type of flour is to spoon it, teaspoon by teaspoon, into the measuring cup. And that way you're not going to get heavily packed flour. Conversely, when you're measuring brown sugar, usually the standard method is that you do firmly pack the brown sugar. And in that recipe, that lady did use brown sugar and she did not pack it. So her flour and her brown sugar ratio is going to be far off. So you, following her directions, are going to get a very different cake than what she got. Another example I will give you. Lekin, most people will say that this is a spoon, right? So if you're following a Hindi or Urdu recipe and they call for a spoon of baking soda, but they are using this, and you are using a spoon, which is this, you'll get a far different outcome. So that's why I really like to have precision in recipes, and that's why I think that a lot of recipes fail on people, and they don't really realize why, and it's not their fault a lot of times. A lot of times it's the recipe that is at fault. So here's also the tools that we will need. You'll need 2 bowls. I like using a larger bowl, and then maybe a more medium-sized bowl. You'll need a whisk. You'll need a spatula. Obviously, you'll need a measuring cup. You'll need a teaspoon in which you can spoon your flour. You will also need 1 cup. This is going to be used to heat up your milk and or eggnog. And then you'll also need 2 8-inch round cake pans. Now, as you see, my cake pan is dark. You can use lighter cake pans, but I'll just let you know at the start that your baking time is going to change depending on how dark your pan is. Darker pans absorb more heat. I do recommend metal pans always for baking cakes. I don't recommend Pyrex. I definitely don't recommend ceramic. Okay, so, and we're also preheating our oven to 350 Fahrenheit. I like to preheat the oven for at least an additional 15 minutes past the time that the oven alert beeps and lets you know that officially the temperature is right. Let it go for another 15 or 20 minutes. Okay, you can pause.
All right, go.
I don't mind if you include those things. That's fine.
It's going.
That's fine. I don't mind.
All right.
So, as I said, we're going to spoon in to our measuring cup 2 1/4 cups of all-purpose flour or plain flour. Then we're going to add 1/4 of a cup of cornstarch. I do prefer Rumford brand, but Argo and really any brand of cornstarch is just fine. This is not an exact, precise science. I'm not measuring by grams, but I am going kind of eyeballing it, about a quarter of this cup. Next, I want baking powder. Now, in this case, it really does matter what brand you use. Please don't use Clabber Girl. I don't understand why this is even a brand that is sold. Clabber Girl, to shave a couple of cents off of their production, they use a process that leaves aluminum in the baking powder, and you definitely can taste it in lighter tasting things like biscuits or butter cookies. Don't use Clabber Girl, use the Rumford brand. If you're in a different country, you probably have another similar brand. So for this, we're going to use 2 teaspoons. And you'll notice that better quality brands of baking powder have this little lip here, and that's designed so that you can use this, you can do the spoon like this, so that you can make sure you're getting an even level and not heaping teaspoon. Those 2 teaspoons of this. Next, we're using something that often gets confused with baking powder, and that is baking soda. They both operate, they both do the same thing, but they operate differently. So powder puffs and soda spreads is the thing that they teach you at school, right? You're going to need 3/4 of a teaspoon of baking soda. Next, you're going to need a 1/2 teaspoon of salt. Yes, it does surprise some people to find out that you need salt in a cake, but all that salt does is it makes sweet things taste sweeter when it's used in the right amounts. You can pause it. So we have all of those ingredients here in this bowl, and I'm going to whisk this. We're whisking for a few reasons. One, it's going to break up any lumps that you may find in the flour, especially in the baking soda or the baking powder. No one wants to bite into a bitter clump of baking powder. Nasty. It's also going to aerate the ingredients, aerate the flour. Don't underestimate how much leavening, how much rising power happens just by the air pockets that are naturally found in your cake. Really, really want to whisk this well. When you think that you've whisked enough, whisk some more. Alternatively, you could use a sieve and sift all of these ingredients. I would recommend you sift about 3 to 4 times at least. Okay, let's move on to our wet ingredients. If this is your first time making a not boxed cake, we usually do separate wet and dry ingredients. And the reason for that is that we don't want to, we need to make sure the ingredients are evenly incorporated, but we don't want to overwork the flour. Flour has gluten in it, and if it's overworked, you will get a chewy cake. Development of gluten is what makes bread chewy. Great for bread, probably not good to have a chewy cake in most cases. So we are going to mix the wet ingredients, and then we will add them to the dry bowl. So let's get into our wet ingredients. So I recommend that you add the ingredients in the same steps that I am adding them, and it will become apparent in a moment why. So as I said, we have 2 eggs. Ideally, these 2 eggs will have sat at room temperature on your kitchen counter for a little while. But if they haven't, that's okay, because the other ingredients are at room temperature and we'll warm them up. So let's crack our 2 eggs. The reason we want to crack the egg here into the bowl first is that if any little bit of shell should get into the bowl, we can easily fish it out and we can see it. Okay, and I don't have any shell here, so that's good. Okay, the next ingredient that we're going to measure out is our brown sugar. Again, as I said, I used light brown sugar. Now we're going to use 1 cup. Did I say the amount yet? No. 1 full cup of brown sugar, light brown sugar. And as I mentioned, the way that we're going to measure this out is brown sugar should always be firmly packed. If you see a recipe and they don't mention firmly packed brown sugar, it's possible that they didn't do that. So that recipe is a little bit sus. I saw a recipe today for a spice cake from the Food Network that included garam masala. I'm not even kidding. I would probably put the link to that recipe on this video. People just make, you know, the internet has just given everybody a mouthpiece. Just everybody can make a recipe, and they don't even have to prove themselves. So you really have to be careful. If you think that you can't cook or you can't bake, it's probably that you just didn't get good directions. That would be my guess. Because everybody can cook and everybody can bake. Word about mise en place, or having everything in place. As you see, before I started, I gathered all of my ingredients. Now I'm lying if I say I always do this. I don't always do this. But if I do this, it definitely makes the process a lot easier and more fun. And when cooking, and especially baking, is more fun, you're more apt to do it more often, right? All right, so there is our firmly packed 1 cup of brown sugar. I'm going to drop that in my bowl. Got that here in my bowl. Top back on that. Alright. Next, I want my oil. I'm going to use 1 cup of oil. Now, if you've ever made the box cake mixes, you may have heard a hack that if you replace the 1 cup of oil with butter, you will get a more homemade cake taste. And that may be true, but plenty of historical or authentic cakes, if that's what you want to call them, absolutely use oil. There's a reason why we use oil instead of butter in some cakes. If you want a cake to remain moist and soft, you should probably use oil. Another thing that you could do is you could use a mix of butter and oil. But if you just use straight butter, your cake is going to get hard in the event you plan to refrigerate it. So if you use any kind of frosting that needs to be refrigerated, like a cream cheese frosting, which this cake will use, for example, when you make the cake with butter, think about what butter does. It's hard. If you put it in the microwave, it melts. But then if you put it back, that melted butter back into the refrigerator, it gets hard again. It does the same thing in your baked goods. It gets hard. So if you don't want a hard cake, I recommend that you use oil. Could you use 2 sticks of butter, i.e. 1 cup of melted butter in place of the 1 cup of oil? Yes, you could. If you're going to get an inferior cake compared to this. So if you want a homemade tasting cake, try actually making a cake rather than making a box cake. Okay, pause.
Yeah.
All right, our next ingredient is our molasses. Molasses is surprisingly difficult to find. They didn't have it at my local Walmart, so I had to buy it from Publix. And that's the unsulfured molasses that I'm using, Grandma's brand. Blackstrap molasses is even more difficult to find in stores, so you're probably going to only have this option anyway. You could, I suppose, use the blackstrap. You're going to get a much more assertively flavored cake. Some people like that, but I would say this is a little bit more kid-friendly. I'm going to pour in, and again, this is, I'm eyeballing. I've only used 1 measuring cup for this entire thing, a 1 cup. So I'm going to use half of a cup of this rich, luscious molasses. This is what gives all gingerbread its lovely flavor. Now the reason why we want to do this in this order, again, as I said, there's a reason for the order of things, is that because we've used this 1 cup to measure out the flour, to measure out the oil, look what happens now as we add this, as we remove this molasses. This is something that is normally incredibly sticky and will never come off, but the measuring cup had a thin layer remaining of the oil. And so it pretty much just all comes off. which is excellent. Very easy step. Put that into my sink to wash. The last of our wet, well, almost the last of our wet ingredients is going to be about a tablespoon to a tablespoon and a half of vanilla. I like artificial vanilla. Real vanilla has just grown exponentially in price. America's Test Kitchen recently did a taste test among their studio audience to find out which baked goods had better flavor, and there was almost no difference between artificial vanilla, vanilla extract, and a real vanilla bean. Very, very little difference. If you're making something that is where the vanilla is the focus flavor, like French vanilla ice cream, okay, yes, I do recommend that you use vanilla bean. Failing that, if you can't afford a $12 bean of vanilla, go with the real vanilla extract. But this is assertively flavored by other things. The vanilla is not going to shine. It's merely a mild, it's a very much a supporting character. So that's why I'm going to use the artificial vanilla. And I am eyeballing that. This part is not an exact science. You can use anywhere from between 3/4 of a teaspoon to a teaspoon and a half. And either way you will be fine. Okay, so the last thing that I want to do, now we have our wet and we have our dry. I'm going to add to my dry bowl some of my spices. Now, it is a ginger snap cake, so we do need ginger, right? Can you pause it? So I'm just using the Badia brand ginger. You can use any brand of powdered ginger, absolutely fine. And I'm going for about 3 teaspoons to 3 heaping teaspoons. This part is not exact, as I said, not an exact science, of ginger. Actually, I have another container since I was almost out that I got today. A little bit more. Don't be shy with the ginger. I'm going to use a little more. Don't be shy with that ginger. It is a ginger cake. All right, next we want some cinnamon. Again, I'm using the Badia brand. Don't be tempted to spend a lot of money on cinnamon unless you know what you're doing. There's 2 basic types of cinnamon. You have Saigon, or Vietnamese cinnamon, which is what is found in most U.S. grocery stores and is what you want for sweet baked goods. And then you have Ceylon, or Sri Lankan cinnamon, which has quite a different taste. It's less smoky and sweet. Like the cinnamon, it's actually more spicy and almost fruity. It almost has a citrus undertone, and it probably would not be good in this cake, or be less good, I think. So don't get too fancy at the grocery store. Just go for the basic kind, the cheapy kind, because that's what you want. Sometimes they won't label what it is when you go to Whole Foods or like the fancier grocery stores. Okay, next I'm going in with nutmeg. I'm going to go in with about a 1/4 teaspoon of nutmeg. We're just eyeballing it, about a 1/4. And then I want, now this one is optional. If you don't already have this, feel free to not buy it because it does get expensive. And if you don't bake a lot, you're probably not going to use this. This is allspice. I'm going to go in with about a 1/4 of a teaspoon of allspice. Another thing you could add, I didn't even think about this, which I'm sure it would be delicious, is a 1/4 of a teaspoon of cloves. That would be great. I didn't even think about that. Last whisk here. You cannot over whisk your flour while there are no wet ingredients in it. So this is definitely the time to mix well, get your ingredients evenly incorporated, make sure there are no lumps in your flour. Little air pockets are always good here. All right. Now, I'm gonna shake off my whisk. I'm gonna give it a good rinse off because I don't want even a little bit of gluten now on my whisk as I whisk up my wet ingredients. And don't worry about over whisking this. You really can't over whisk at this stage. Just try to get it as evenly incorporated as you can. My eggs were almost completely fresh out of the refrigerator, so they're pretty cold. So this process is helping to warm them up a little bit. All of the other ingredients, as I said, were already room temp. A nice thing about this recipe is that we don't need to get out our hand mixer or the KitchenAid blender, KitchenAid mixer. This is all things that can be done with just 2 bowls and our whisk and a spatula. We don't need a lot of tools for this. That's another reason why I am less of a fan of butter cakes. Butter cakes tend to need the butter and sugar to get creamed together. And then that butter and sugar usually needs to cream for like 3 or 4 minutes on high in the KitchenAid mixer. I'm not a fan of that. It's complicated. So I don't want to do that. All right, so now this is where our cup comes in. We're going to we need a total of about 3/4 of a cup of milk or milk plus eggnog. Now I recommend that you don't do what I did. Keep your measuring cup, your 1 cup measuring cup out and measure about 3/4 of a cup of the liquid and put it in here. I've been doing this long enough, I can measure out 3/4 of a cup by eyeball. So if you are only using milk, do use whole milk and put in 3/4 of a cup. If you're going to use some eggnog in there, which I recommend because it's going to add even more richness to your cake, put in about a 1/2 of a cup of whole milk and finish up the 3/4 of a cup with 1/4 of a cup of the eggnog. I'm going to pop this now into the microwave for about 1.5 minutes. We want this hot, 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 almost to boiling. Pause. All right, so now if you've done everything in those steps that I've done it, which I highly recommend you do everything exactly as I did it. I've taken this out of the microwave, my milk. I had it in the microwave on high for 1.5 minutes. As you can see, it is steaming, it's really hot. And so now we're going to incorporate our wet ingredients into the dry. Okay. And at this point, our whisk has done its job. And we're going to put it away. And we're going to bring out our spatula. And the reason that we want to do that is, number one, it's going to help us get our bowl clean here, making cleanup way easier, making sure that we minimize the loss of our batter. And 2, it will prevent overmixing. Remember what I said before about how flour has gluten in it. And the last thing that we want is to overwork our flour once it gets wet. Well, it's wet now. So we're folding. I saw an episode of Schitt's Creek, and for some reason they were talking about baking something. And the mother and the son were saying, "What is folding?" And they just kept repeating folding. It's folding, but they neither knew. This is what folding is. This is taking my spatula down and under and lifting it back up towards the center. And we just want to do that until we see almost no dry patches of flour. If we see some, that's fine. If you try to make it perfectly mixed and even, you will have a perfectly mixed, overworked bit of flour. Now, just now, I got into the bottom and I picked up a dry patch of flour. So, you can change it. You can go clockwise, and then you can go anti-clockwise. Just try for the middle. All right, we're getting close to the point that we are over mixing. So we're almost there, 90% of the way there. You can also just kind of pat the top. All right, we're there. Now, as you can see, there's still patches of flour in there. That is fine. But more or less, all of our flour is hydrated. Now, at this point, we're putting in milk. Usually, it's extremely rare that you see hot liquids added to cake batter. The reason that we're adding this hot liquid is it's going to activate our baking soda in here. And so in a moment, you're going to start to see this cake batter bubble up. It really does need to be very, very hot, mind you, not just warm. It needs to be hot. All right, I'm going to give this just a second, and I'm going to come over here and I'm going to get my cake pans. Now, I did previously give these a light greasing with that same canola oil that we used. You could also just grease them in butter. You do want to make sure to always grease your cake pans or cake tins or whatever you're using. So Eric just noticed something. He said the batter looks a little bit thin, and that is true. Don't be alarmed. This is going to look thinner than what you're used to, and that's because we want a light, airy batter, and it's going to appear lighter still as it rises. Now, if you have a scale, you're going to be in an even better position to get both of your cake layers perfectly balanced. I don't have a scale. I'm kind of eyeballing it. If that is something that is important to you, to have perfectly even, nice. If you really want to make sure that you have perfectly even cake layers, just ask your local teenager, because I have found that they always have scales. I think they are measuring their macros. That's got to be what it is. You always had a cake scale when you were a teenager. It was a cake scale, right? You had?
Yep.
Okay.
It only went up to 200 grams.
Oh. That's what Mommy thought. All right. I'm just going to get a paper towel and I will wipe down the side here. Okay. Down that side. All right. Now I've used my spatula. This is going to be a lot easier to clean now. Both of these bowls and everything is a lot easier to clean because of the spatula. It also made, like I said, if I had used the whisk, which obviously cannot fold, it would have created a much denser, overbeaten, chewy cake. All right, now both of these cake layers are about to go into the oven for between 28 to 30 minutes. I recommend 28 if you're using a light pan, excuse me, 30 if you're using a light pan, and 28 minutes if you're using a darker pan, like I'm using. Okay, you can stop. All right, so our cakes baked at 350 F for exactly 30 minutes. At that point, I took them out of the oven and they stayed in their pans to cool for about 20 minutes, and then I was able to remove them from the oven. I put them on parchment paper here, and we're now going to get started on the frosting. Our cakes do need to be cooling for at least an hour, maybe 2 hours. If you don't have the ability to leave them on the counter that long, what you can do is you can wrap them in plastic wrap. I do recommend that you get one of these ones that has the slide cutter. If you can, it just makes life so much easier to deal with plastic wrap. But I don't need to do that. I can leave these out on the counter for the short time that I need them to cool. We're now going to make our frosting. What we will need for the frosting is 1 stick of butter. that has come to room temperature. Now, I didn't take my butter out of the refrigerator on time, so to get closer to room temperature much faster, as you can see, I just cut it into thin slices. This is salted butter. A lot of people will tell you to use unsalted butter and instead to add maybe like a quarter of a teaspoon of salt, because you do need salt again with almost all sweet things to improve the sweet taste. I don't think that's necessary. In the 1960s, butter brands used to be, they used to have a lot more variation in the amount of salt that they had, brand to brand, and even batch to batch. That's not the case anymore. And due to people wanting less salt in their diet, most butter brands do have a lot less salt. So you really don't have to worry about using salt. You can use salted or unsalted. It's a lot more standardization among the brands. So this is salted, 1 stick of butter or 8 tablespoons. We also have 2 bricks of cream cheese. I recommend that you use cream cheese like this, and not the one that comes in the tub that says it's whipped spread. I don't know what it is that makes that less suitable for baking, because they all use gums, xanthan gum, carob gum, guar gum, things like that, to help stabilize them. But I think there's way less of those ingredients in this as opposed to the whipped one, and that will affect your ability to bake with it or make it into frosting. So use the bricks. So you want 2 of these. These are each 8 ounces, so that's 16 ounces. Again, we're going to need some vanilla. I'm using artificial vanilla. You will need confectionery sugar, also known as powdered sugar. And you will need, this is a secret ingredient, lemon curd. And if you can't you can usually easily find lemon curd in the grocery store. It's a really inexpensive ingredient. But this will really make a thick and luscious frosting. Another thing that you will need is half of a lemon. We're going to use the juice of half of a lemon. And then we're also using Gingersnap cookies. So let me show you the brand of Gingersnap cookies that I'm using today. This is my favorite brand. It's Stouffer's Snaps. And I just love these ginger biscuits or ginger cookies. They're really the best. And you can make them yourself, but the ones you make yourself are really just as good as these. These are just as good as homemade. So why make it yourself if store-bought is just as good? We're only making this cake because we can't easily buy a cake that's this good. Oops. So I'm going to use obviously this lemon, this half of a lemon, and then I've cut up 6 biscuits, 6 of these biscuits that we're going to use. We cut them in half, so we're going to put half moons on the top of the cake, and then I've cut up about 1 cup of the rest of the biscuits that we're going to put on the side of the cake crushed. Okay, you can. All right, so I've put our softened 1 stick of butter into the mixer. You can do this with a hand mixer, but you are going to have a harder time of it. And yes, I guess you could do this by hand with a whisk, but you're really going to have a hard time of it. It's going to be a workout. So if you're looking for a good workout, do it by hand. But I'm going to take the easy way out, and I'm going to use my mixer. I'm using the balloon whisk. And let me see here. I'm just going to start breaking up the butter. Periodically, even when you are using a mixer, you're still going to have a spatula and get in there and mix things up a little bit. Now, the purpose of doing this, we're actually mixing it up far more than you might think. is that this, again, we're aerating the butter. Our next step is to add our bricks of cream cheese. Now these are softened to room temperature, but if they were not, in that case, it will be just fine. But I do recommend, if they're not softened to room temperature, do add them in chunks. Don't add them all in one go. If they're really cold, you could just like chop them up on your chopping board, your cutting board. Cut them into chunks. But as it stands, these are warm, and so I can start to add them slowly, one brick at a time. Sometimes you need to get in there with your whisk and in between the balloon whisk wires, and the stuff will get stuck in there. You really want this to be evenly mixed, this frosting. You know, if you don't feel confident to make things yourself, like, you know, cakes and frosting, it's apparent from the baking aisle that a lot of people use pre-made boxed mixes and frosting. That's fine, but I would say pick something to make homemade. I'm not a big fan of cake mixes in the box because they taste a little bit artificial to me. They also have a lot of weird chemicals in them. We don't quite know what those chemicals do to our bodies, but I still think most of them are way better. Especially I like the Duncan Hines brand over Pillsbury. So I do think those are way better than the pre-made frosting. I think the frosting is terrible that comes out of a jar. So if you can only make one, if you feel that doing everything from scratch, homemade, is too much work, I recommend that you do the boxed cake mix and then make your own frosting. And it will be worth it. All right, in goes our second brick of cream cheese. Every time that you add a new ingredient into your mixer, or if you have, whether it's a stand mixer or hand mixer, start on low speed. All right, I'm just going to break this up inside of the wire whisk a little bit, and then we're going to start to add some more liquid ingredients, because as you can see, it's getting very thick and I don't want to strain my mixer's motor. I'm just going to blend this up for just one more second. Okay. Let's start to add our other ingredients. So we're going to add some vanilla. Now I'm really just eyeballing this. I think I'm going to use about 2 teaspoons in there, something like that. And then we're going to use, with impeccably clean hands, of course, that we've been using so far. No rings on our hands, no artificial nails. If you have long nails or you have acrylic nails, you should be wearing gloves for this step. I've thoroughly washed my hands. I don't have any jewelry on. And we're going to try to use the juice of an entire 1/2 of a lemon. Now, I also use lemon curd, as I told you before. You can absolutely use store-bought lemon curd. There's not a huge difference between the one in the quality and the taste in the lemon curd that you make at home versus the one you buy in the store. So I always say, only make at home what is either going to save you a lot of money or what is going to give you a big difference in quality versus store-bought. Lemon curd, there isn't a huge difference. There really isn't. The same thing for orange curd. So I feel fine to buy those. I might make a recipe one day to show how to make lemon curd. There's so many bad recipes online. The recipe from the Food Network for lemon curd from Ina Garten, I'm sure she never actually saw the recipe, they just stuck her name on it. They explain to use whole eggs. You never use whole eggs in lemon curd. Why? The yolk of the egg thickens sauces and curds, while the white sets. And so you're gonna get, and it also tastes, the eggy taste from eggs comes from the egg white. So if you used whole eggs in that recipe, you would get something that is set like scrambled eggs. I don't think you want that. And a lot of the comments were actually people saying, gee, I don't know what I did wrong. Again, you didn't do anything wrong. You're using a failed recipe. And I've seen that wasn't the only super popular online celebrity cook to use whole eggs in their lemon curd. That's wrong. It's not my opinion. It's just the wrong way to do it. So we're going to use about 2 heaping teaspoons of lemon curd here. And it's just going to make it a little extra rich and thick and velvety, our frosting. Side there. Now again, I'm starting it on low because I do have liquidy things in there and I don't want my vanilla and lemon juice to spill out. Keep in mind that also whenever you use your mixer, of course, you'd be using a different attachment. You wouldn't be using this balloon whisk. But anytime you're making a mixture of anything in your stand mixer, like cookie dough, you always want to scrape down the bowl and scrape down the whisk so that you get good results. If you don't, you won't get good cookie batter. It'll be all weird and uneven. For a moment, it looked like my frosting was starting to separate, but I kept mixing, I kept with it, and now it looks a lot smoother. Now we start to add our confectioner sugar or powdered sugar. Now this we definitely want to add teaspoon by teaspoon, and I can't tell you an exact amount because you're really going to go by taste. What tastes good to you, and you're also going to go by consistency. What looks like a thick, spreadable frosting to you. We're adding little by little, and we're also, again, we're adding on slow because we don't want a bunch of confectioner sugar to blow back all over our kitchen. So on the lowest possible setting. Again, scraping down. It seems like a lot of extra work to do when you have a machine until you ever actually have to do it by hand. And then you get to feel the difference. Okay, let's add more sugar. Probably gonna add at least 3 and up to 4.5 cups of this powdered sugar. Sounds like a lot, but it is nowhere near as sweet. It has nowhere near as much sugar, like as compared to granulated sugar, cup for cup, as granulated sugar. It's a lot of cornstarch in powdered sugar. That's what makes it powdered. We're almost there, y'all. We're getting there. Okay. All right, now I'm about to go in and taste this in just a minute and see if I have enough sugar. Now I'm gonna go in with a teaspoon that is gonna go in to the frosting, and then it will go into my mouth, and it will not go back into the frosting. And why will it not go back into the frosting? Even if it's a cake that you are making only for yourself. You say, I don't care about it, it's only my germs. Why will it not go back into the frosting? Because you have natural bacteria in your mouth, and that bacteria is designed to help break down food. We're talking about even the cleanest mouth. You just brushed your teeth. Your saliva has bacteria in it. And it's great for your mouth so that food will break down and not destroy your teeth. Not so great for foods that you intend to store and eat later. Very perfect. I'm sorry I can't tell you an exact measurement. You really have to go, you have to taste. And you go by consistency and you go by taste. So if I were to taste, maybe add a little bit more sugar, taste again, putting that dirty spoon back in there, that bacteria now goes into my frosting, and it will cause my frosting to break down a lot faster, and it'll spoil faster. I've seen people double dip salsas and dips for chip because they're the only person eating, but then those things spoil really quickly. So just something to keep in mind. No double dipping, even if you are a solo person. Okay, you can pause it. All right, we're all ready now. So we have a couple of options at this point. We can either use a cake stand, which right now I'm using as, turn it over and use it as a punch bowl for my onions. That's not happening. I'm just gonna use this plastic cake taker. And I'm going to start by taking a dollop of frosting. I'll smear it here in the center. And the purpose of that is that it will hold your cake layer in place. Because as you see, this is quite a smooth surface. So if we only put that cake layer down, we would be in some trouble. It's a very soft cake due to all that molasses and brown sugar. So some bits of cake are falling off. This is what happened the last time I made it. I'm just going to brush these into the sink here. All right. All right, the next thing that I want is, this. Now, I don't remember how much this cost me. I bought it online. It's the Wilton brand. I don't know what you would even call this tool. A frosting spread, I guess. You can buy plastic ones that are almost as good. And another thing that you can use, it's a very common tool for bakers, is a bench scraper. You can buy those at Walmart or the dollar store for $1. We're going to start with our frosting right in the center like that. Now, you might wonder, why did I use so much lemon in the frosting? Why not something spiced? I've seen a lot of spice cakes recommend spicing the frosting also. I think that horrible Sandra Lee cake, spice cake that had garam masala in it, may have also spiced the frosting. I don't think you need to spice frosting for when the cake is spiced. I think that the opposite. You probably will want something that will contrast that spiced cake layer, the cinnamon and the ginger and the cloves and the nutmeg and the allspice. I think that you'll do better to have something bright and zesty, fresh and lemony. And you probably would not do wrong to also add some lemon zest here. But what you don't want to do is add cinnamon and ginger and nutmeg into the frosting. It's just going to be overkill. You want a little contrast. You can pause it. All right, so now we very carefully took our second cake layer. We put it on the top of this bottom layer and the frosting. It's up to you. You could use a bread knife. Is perfect to take off the very top of the layer and make this perfectly even and square. I'm not going to bother with that. Cake is still going to look great even without that. And honestly, I don't want to get rid of cake unnecessarily. Now, you want to make sure at this point, well, and actually before, that your frosting spreader goes into the frosting and never touches the bare cake, because that's how you get crumbs from cake back into the frosting. If at any point you see that accidentally you've got some crumbs on there, be mindful and wipe it off. Try to use as much frosting as you can at this point. It's going to look like too much, but that is going to prevent you from the frosting spreader meeting with the cake and finding any crumbs on it. Not that that's going to be a huge issue, and I'll show you why in a minute, but this is just a general rule for frosting cakes. We don't want to have crumbs in our cake. Alright, that's pretty good for the top. And the rest for the sides. Alright, this is a great time to have a roll of paper towels ready. Because as you can see, I'm starting to already got one crumb there. Now at this point, at least for this cake, a crumb is not going to matter here because I intend to use crushed Gingersnap biscuits on the side of this cake. Doesn't matter if I get crumbs at this point. However, if I weren't going to put crushed cookies, it very much would matter, right? So, always be ready. Like at this point, you'd want to use a paper towel. Another thing that you could do is you could just scrape the side of your bowl. And that's firm enough that it's going to stay up here and not come down to the bottom. But like I said, with this particular cake, that doesn't matter. If you do find you get a bunch of crumbs in your frosting and there's nothing you can do to fix it, the answer is crushed up cookies on it. Or crushed up, or sprinkles or something. That's what the bakeries do. So when you see crushed up something or other on a bakery cake, you know what happened. They got crumbs in the frosting, and that's how they fixed it. It's a happy accident. But I do rather want to try to avoid any crumbs there on the top. I want that to be smooth. Going to take a few minutes because it's going to take some time. So I'll be back in just a few minutes and you can see the finished product. All right, so we're done frosting the cake. The cake is going to look a lot more rustic if you do it the way I did it, which was I did not refrigerate my cake layers, and I also didn't take the time to refrigerate my frosting for about an hour. If you refrigerate your frosting for about an hour, you're going to get much stiffer frosting. It's going to be a lot easier to work with. I didn't do that. And so the frosting is a little hard to make perfectly smooth. Another thing that you can do is you can frost this as I've done it, put it in the fridge, for about even 20 or 30 minutes will make a big difference. And then come through again with your frosting spreader, which is at room temperature or even a little tiny bit hot. You can dip it in some hot water and then wipe it off and make sure it's completely dry. And then you run that over the frosting and you're going to get a nice, smooth, perfectly even layer of frosting. Again, I haven't done that because I'm kind of in a hurry with this cake. Still a good cake. It's not as perfect looking though as it could have been had I taken the time to do those other steps. Now feel free to put as many or as few of these on your cake as you want. Another thing that you could do instead is you could, is that too many? I think I need one more. Another thing that you could do is you could just put one cookie in the center, a few cookies in the center, I don't know. You could just put the crushed cookies along the side. It's up to you. Do what works for you. I'm sure you can find some cute ways to decorate your cookies. Our neighbors are so loud. All right, so now we're going in with our crushed cookies. And as you can see, just going to little by little Add these crushed cookies to the side. Not only does it hide imperfections in the frosting, but it's a really nice texture that you add, because obviously most people eat the wedge of cake front end or thin end of the wedge first. So this is the last little bit of the cake that they're going to experience. And after eating a very soft and rich cake with that tangy, lemony, and also rich frosting, these slightly spicy cookies are just a nice contrast to everything. So there is our cake, more or less. I hope that you try it. It's really easy, you know, compared to some other cakes. If you've ever tried like making your own meringue in a pie, or if you have ever made some butter cakes where you had to cream butter and sugar together, this is obviously a lot easier to do. I'm just crushing up a little bit more of the cookies for the side of the cake. I underestimated how much I would need. So I really hope that you'll try this, and I think that it is worth the effort. And if you were to taste this next to a box cake mix, like a spice cake, I think I've seen that in the store. Make the two next to each other, and this will be so infinitely better and fresh tasting, real tasting. You really won't want to make a box cake again. All right, thank you for watching. Goodbye.